Okay, hello everyone. This is Volts for January 21st, 2026. Let's dig a little deeper into virtual power plants. I'm your host, David Roberts. Virtual power plants, or VPPs, are all the rage these days. For those who need a quick refresher, a VPP is a collection of small-scale, usually behind-the-meter, distributed energy resources. Think rooftop panels, home batteries, electric vehicles, water heaters, HVAC systems, coordinated by software to act in unison as a single entity. A VPP can, depending on its composition, produce or store power, reduce or shift demand. It can, to varying degrees, simulate the behavior of utility-scale power plants or batteries. When I have discussed VPPs in the past, I have mostly done so at a fairly high level of abstraction, as though they are a single kind of thing. But of course, in reality, there are many different kinds of VPPs at varying stages of development with varying capabilities. Today, we are going to get nerdy on VPPs. To do so, I have the perfect guest, Seth Frader-Thompson, the founder and CEO of EnergyHub, the biggest VPP wrangler in the US. It currently manages over 1.8 million devices, which add up to more than 2 gigawatts of grid capacity. EnergyHub recently released a white paper introducing a VPP maturity model, a framework to assess the varying capabilities of VPPs and their usefulness to grid operators. It seemed like a perfect jumping off point for a deeper discussion, so let's do this. Seth Frader-Thompson, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be nerdy about VPPs.
Before we even dive in, I just wanted to check very first thing. There are some people out there, I think maybe the people at Sunrun still, who think that distributed power plant is a better term than virtual power plant. Do you care at all about that linguistic dispute? Are you invested either way?
The short answer is I do care. I think that today it doesn't make a huge difference, but the real answer to that probably gets a lot to the meat of what we're going to talk about and this white paper. Today, it doesn't matter. The distributed piece is not necessarily valued by the market, but as we get into talking about the Hewell's test and what comes after the Hewell's test, that distributed piece gets really important.
Okay, well, we're just going to use VPP then because that seems like what everybody else is doing. Okay, so Seth, there are many VPPs out there in the US doing their thing today, but as I understand it, most of them are effectively acting as what's called demand response, which means that when the grid operator runs into an unexpected event, say a surge in demand or something that they didn't anticipate and they need to call on kind of emergency resources, they'll call on a VPP. And I think where we want to get all of us involved in this is to a place where grid operators are calling on VPPs on a daily dispatch basis, basically where they are actually treating them like reliable, power plants, where they're actually treating them like power plants in their portfolio. And that, I think, is rare today. So what we're going to be talking about basically is how to get VPPs from their current state to that state. But before we get to that, let's just start with a little bit about EnergyHub, or about what you're doing. So those 1.8 million devices out there in the world that EnergyHub is managing in one way or another, what are those devices? What are the big categories?
Yeah, well, first, the good news is that number jumped just in the last few weeks. We finished the year at about 1.9 million under what you would have called sort of just the EnergyHub business. But in December, we acquired a company called Residio Grid Services. It was another DERMS provider, and they brought another 650,000 devices onto the platform. So we now have 2.5 million DERs, which is awesome. But that doesn't answer the question. The vast majority today, from a device count perspective, are thermostats, then followed by batteries and EVs. On a megawatts basis, there's lots of other stuff in there, typically C&I resources, which can be anything from, the HVAC system at a hospital to an electric school bus or a fleet of electric school buses.
That's commercial and industrial.
That's right.
So on a numbers basis, it's mostly thermostats. But when you look at who's got megawatts at play, the big megawatt players tend to be commercial and industrial system, just because they're bigger, I'm guessing.
That's right. Yep. And so I think megawatts, maybe call it 20%. We're at about 3,500 megawatts, 3.5 gigawatts. Maybe 20% of that is commercial industrial.
Interesting. So your product, your basic product is software, as I understand it, that is meant to track, monitor, coordinate these devices. So one of the things I'm sort of curious about is that software truly agnostic? In other words, can you plug anything that uses electricity into it? Or do you have to is there a lot of bespoke programming if you want to kind of add a new category? Like if you weren't tracking any water heaters and a water heater VPP came along, would you have to do some reprogramming or is it truly agnostic as is?
The software is technically agnostic, but a lot of the value comes from when you go beyond sort of purely agnostic. And so the strength of VPPs that are made up of millions of resources is that each one of them is behaving somewhat randomly, but when you put that together at scale and you use AI and machine learning to forecast and control that, you have very high degrees of predictability.
Right.
And your ability to forecast very precisely and then control very precisely, it doesn't depend, but it is certainly enhanced by knowing what that thing is and what are the physics of it.
So if you're going to add like a big water heater program, then you would do some sort of like, here are the specific qualities of water heaters, just so the software is aware of it.
Right. So you think about if you've got a thermostat in a home, it probably makes sense to figure out what's the behavior of that home under different weather conditions. When it's particularly hot or humid, does the home heat up or cool down particularly quickly? And so that would change what sort of settings you might send to the HVAC system. If you've got a battery, you probably want to know, what's the state of charge? What's the typical operation mode that battery's in on its own? You also need to know things like what's the proximity of one device to another. That gets to be particularly important if you're trying to get into that distributed angle and trying to understand what's the impact that you might be having on the local grid and what's fungible, right? So if you're controlling an electric vehicle that's plugged in overnight, you have a huge amount of flexibility in whether you charge that thing at 9 p.m. or 2 a.m. Whereas if you're controlling an HVAC system, the homeowner does in fact care quite a bit whether you're cooling their home at 9 p.m. or 2 a.m.
Right. And in practice, currently, are most extant VPP programs basically single device programs? Like in practice, in the field, are these programs mostly like, here's a bunch of thermostats, here's a bunch of water heaters, or are there currently operating VPPs that are multi-device?
So the answer to both questions is yes. The vast majority are single DER programs. And the reason for that is that's how utilities tend to be funded by their regulators. So utility will figure out there's potential here to do a lot with smart thermostats. So we're going to launch a smart thermostat program, and then they hire a company like EnergyHub to provide the software to run that. But we do have quite a few programs where utilities are blending these things together. We have talked publicly about maybe 3 or 4 folks like National Grid, APS, Eversource, Duke Energy. But it's actually kind of up to the utility at the end. If they have several programs that are kind of running in their silos, there's not necessarily anything stopping them from putting those together in a more interesting, more advanced way.
Right. And what we're going to talk about later, the sort of advanced VPP, I think, basically requires device heterogeneity. It requires multiple devices.
Absolutely. You're much stronger through diversity.
Yeah. You can't do a lot of the things that we want VPPs to do if you're using single devices. Okay, so right now, as we said, most VPP programs in practice, grid operators do not view them basically as equivalent to a power plant. And I want to talk briefly about what grid operators and utilities want from VPPs. So you have this list here: visibility, schedulability, and availability. These are sort of like the qualities that grid operators and utilities need from VPPs. Here's what we need if we're going to treat you as a real power plant. Can you just go through that list real quick and talk about what those qualities mean from a utility perspective?
You said at the beginning that a lot of this came out of the world of demand response. And in demand response, you'd build a resource that you kind of hoped you didn't have to use, but you were glad it was there when you pushed the button. And so that meant that if you were a utility making planning decisions, it was a backup. It wasn't an operational resource. And so the transition to being operational is, in a way, pretty straightforward. You want to know, is this thing there? So right now, what's available to me?
That's visibility.
That's visibility. And then if you say, all right, I need to deploy this thing, a classic thing would be a 4-hour block on a hot afternoon or a cold morning. And so that's the ability to schedule it. But ideally, the schedulability goes a little beyond that. It's not just I need this many megawatts over this period. It probably has some ramp rate. So you sort of turn this thing on, ramp in, hold a particular level, and then come down. You might actually have it sort of change its output hour by hour. So that's schedulability.
Interesting. And you'll want to ramp in and ramp out, generally speaking, won't you? Like the grid doesn't like big jumps.
Exactly. And actually, we should talk about that a little bit in the context of what happened in California last summer with DSGS. Maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I'll touch on it briefly here. The operator really wants to know how quickly is this thing going to react. And a lot of the decisions that they are used to making have all these built-in sort of assumptions around how quickly a big spinning piece of metal in a power plant would behave. And so a lot of people were very surprised when a few hundred megawatts worth of batteries reacted very quickly. And so that just gets back to this thing of you need the ability to schedule it. You need to be able to give it sort of a shape.
All right.
So the last piece of this is availability. And availability is not a binary thing, right? You can have something that is only available, a certain number of hours or under certain conditions, and that you can still provide a ton of value even if your availability is low. But generally, the more availability, the more valuable this thing is. So that's what those three pillars are.
So they want to be able to see what it is and its capabilities. They want to be able to tell it when to come on and come off, and they want it there when they need it.
That's right.
And I think, just hearkening back to what we said just a minute ago, if you have a VPP program that is, say, I don't know, all solar panels, right? Like solar panels generate when they generate. You can't necessarily schedule.
Right. They're not dispatchable.
And I guess there are probably some like time and level restrictions on thermostats too that hedge into that a little bit. So getting back again, just to like the more diversity you have, the more likely you are to be able to check these boxes.
Exactly.
And so if you check them all, if we design a VPP, which I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is an extant VPP that completely gets there. But if you did get to that point where you are, from a grid perspective, visible, schedulable, and available, then you pass what's called the Hewell's test. Talk a little bit about the Hewell's test, which I find delightful.
Yeah. So what I love about the Hewell's test is that...
Well, first tell us who it's named after, because it's not... I kept thinking it was some riff on fuels, but it's not.
Oh, no. It's named after a person. His name is Matthias Hewells, a former member of the sort of data science team here doing kind of the AI algorithms. So he basically started with this thought experiment, which was, okay, AI had the Turing test, which is essentially, can you have a computer that you're having a conversation with, over text? And it isn't obvious whether you're talking to a person or a computer.
Right. Can it convince a human that it's a human?
Exactly. And so he said, what if we had this for power plants. Could you replace a conventional power plant with a VPP and a grid operator can't tell the difference?
Right.
And so sort of as soon as I heard that, I just said, like, this just boils it down to something that is so clear to people.
Yeah.
So that resonated. We started talking about that with customers. I think everybody kind of loved it. But what we wanted to do next was say, all right, that's binary. We know we don't entirely pass it today. So let's come up with some milestones. And where we looked for inspiration in milestones was the autonomous driving framework that the Society of Automotive Engineers have.
Right. All the levels of autonomy.
Exactly. And so Mobileye, the company, has done a really kind of successful job of sort of communicating feet off, hands off, eyes off, right? And so cruise control is feet off. Hands off is you're sort of monitoring this thing and just letting it drive itself, but you got to pay attention. And then eyes off means, you can be watching Netflix while you're on a road trip. And so we said, all right, this makes sense. Let's do this for VPPs.
Right. And this is super nerdy, but I want to walk through those levels.
We should.
Because I think they're very illuminating. So the Hewell's test, as you say, is binary. Turing test is, can a computer convince a human that it's human? Hewell's test is, can a virtual power plant convince a grid operator that it's a power plant, basically?
That's right. And I should say there is a difference between passing the Hewell's test from a technical perspective and functionally eliminating the need, say, for a gas peaker plant. Like, you can do that. You can genuinely stabilize the grid and prevent the utility or a wholesale market from dispatching a wholesale power plant without being fully at the level of passing the Hewell's test.
Right. There's plenty of value in the preceding levels before you get there. You don't have to get there to produce value. All right. So let's go through these levels. There are 5 levels. Let's start with level 0, which is just basic demand response, basically.
Yeah, level 0 you used to call press and pray. And what's fascinating about level 0 is that for decades, level 0 was providing value, right? Utilities built these systems where they would go to people's homes and hook up a switch that would essentially interrupt the signal from your thermostat to your HVAC system, or temporarily shut off your water heater. And those would get activated by a one-way paging signal. There was no data coming back to the utility. They'd have to do kind of random sampling using data loggers to figure out what the impact was. But the utility could see in aggregate at the system level that when they broadcast that message, something happened and it lessened the demand on the grid. So in a way, everything we're doing is sort of standing on the shoulders of the people who built successful business models and operating models.
That's been around for a while, like that basic demand response.
20, 30 years.
Yeah. And a lot of that is also commercial and industrial, involving like grid operators, calling people.
Right, exactly.
Calling people on the phone saying, ramp down your whatever at whatever hour, so.
Right. Classically, like Macy's in Herald Square in New York City, they'd call whoever was in charge of the air conditioning and ask them to shut down the air conditioning or turn it up. Or you'd call a cold storage facility and have them do something similar.
Yeah. So that's basic demand response, which means you're just sending a signal out, you're pinging a signal out to all these devices, either through the phone or through some switch, and then more or less hoping for the best.
That's right.
That's level 0. Then you get to level 1, which is this basic demand response plus a little data coming back. What does that look like?
That looks like if you're the utility operator, you push the button and now you're able to look at a graph showing you what's happening with this thing. And so it's showing you a load curve. It's showing you acknowledgments of the devices. So if you're broadcasting a signal to 100,000 or 1 million devices, the first thing you know is that this was successfully delivered. Then you know that signal not only was delivered, but the devices are acting on it. It gives you a sense of, are customers overriding it? Are they uncomfortable? And then finally, you get some load data coming back to show what the impact is. But you're still, to be nerdy about it, you're still open loop on the load shape, right? So what you get is what you get based on you probably sent the same signal to everyone all at the same time, and you're not necessarily closing the loop to control what that load shape is.
So you're not fine-tuning here. It's still a pretty crude signal.
Right. And the criticism of level 1 would be that if it's a bunch of thermostats, you're going to get a big load shed at the beginning of the event. that says, all right, these homes all raise the temperature on their air conditioner by a couple of degrees. They're now all kind of coasting to the new temperature, and then they're going to start air conditioning themselves again at a higher temperature. So if you're the utility, what you see is a big load shed in the first hour that gradually decays in hours 2, 3, and 4.
Oh, interesting.
If you're doing this with batteries and you're not thinking about what's the state of charge of each battery, you're seeing the batteries essentially run out of juice as they discharge themselves into the grid. And so the reason to bring level 2 in is where you have the ability to provide flat load shapes. So you train a model on what's the behavior of each individual device going to be in response to a signal. And then the system will figure out how to tune those signals. Either do you go a little bit less deep with the initial activation, or do you stagger the timing of each of these devices?
Right. So cut in the thermostats here, and then an hour later you start the batteries.
Exactly.
Because you're sort of like, you're working at the timing of these multiple devices so that they average out to flattening the load.
Or they average out to something that isn't flat, but is something you drew, right? I created a multi sort of stage ramp. And so that's kind of where we are today, that with a multi-DER aggregation, we can do a pretty good job at level 2.
To be clear, you don't get to level 2 unless you have multiple kinds of devices that you're...
No, you can actually be a single DER level 2. You can. It's more valuable if you're doing more than one together. You get to do, instead of a 4-hour event, you can do a 6 or 8 hour event. If you want to do extra flat load shape, it's better that way, but you can do level 2 with just a single one.
So what's required for level 2 that you don't have at level 1? Is it just the multi-directional communication? What is the sort of piece that you're adding?
It tends to be things like data, how high quality, what's the latency of the data. There typically is some degree, at level 2, you are doing some sort of limited locational stuff. So a utility might say, okay, we care about providing relief to, a neighborhood that's served by a substation that is getting close to its operating limit. And so the utility can target the event at that. What you're not doing at level 2 that you start to do at level 3 is really mapping in sort of a semi-real-time way how the VPP is overlaid into level 3, or you're sort of better integrated into the other systems that the utility uses operationally to run the grid. But I guess we should just pause for one more second on level 2. Level 2 is one of these things where there are no technology problems that need to be solved at level 2 at all. And there aren't even system integration problems to be solved at level 2. Level 2 is basically getting everybody in the value chain to just provide the same kind of table stakes, making sure that they're providing high quality data with low latency and feeding that into the necessary systems through EnergyHub systems and then on over to the utility, essentially at parity among each other. So basically what I'm trying to say is there are some companies in the DER chain who allow us to operate fully at level 2, and then there are some who still have work to do. That's just a matter of people finishing up some work.
And to be clear, level 2 is currently the most sophisticated VPP. Like, are there level 3 VPPs yet, or is that a gleam in your eye?
I think level 3 is the topic of light disagreement in the industry right now.
What counts as getting there?
Yeah, which is, to me, that's kind of success. That was the whole point of this framework, is to kind of have a common language for these things. But so there are companies out there who I think are making a reasonable point that says that, they have highly available, highly forecastable, highly predictable systems that from a control perspective, basically from an output and outcomes perspective, are basically at level 3. And I would generally agree with them. Where I think they aren't quite there yet is how well integrated into other systems are they? So in other words, if you're a utility and you're using some level of unit commitment software or some other software that kind of mixes all the different supply sources together into your overall supply plan, generally speaking, I don't think there are VPPs that fully sort of integrate into the utility's workflow today.
So even the advanced VPPs are sort of treated as kind of an extra thing.
Exactly. And that's kind of the core of it, is that if you don't make this tool look like the existing tools, it's sort of relegated to being an extra thing, or it's relegated to being viewed as a demand side tool as opposed to a supply resource.
Right. But you say level 3 does pass the Hewell's test. Like that does basically behave like a power plant.
Exactly. And so that's where I think at the end of the day, if you're running a power plant, right, there's a stream of telemetry coming off that power plant telling you exactly what it's doing.
And briefly, just tell us what telemetry is.
Telemetry is just a bunch of data showing what that is. And so if you're thinking about a power plant, you probably are looking at flow rates of fuel, how many RPMs a turbine is spinning, things like that. But there's probably other things just like what's the frequency of the supply coming out of that, what's the megawatt level, et cetera. In general, I'm not aware of a VPP that produces telemetry on par with a power plant today. I think the output is there, but the data that would give an operator total confidence that it's working is not quite there.
Okay, so this gets us up to level 3. Level 2, interestingly, in your chart, you're still calling DR rather than a VPP. You're calling it basically enhanced, fancy demand response.
That's right.
It is when you get to level 3 and you're automated in some sense, automated and integrated in the utility sort of workflow that you use the term VPP, automated VPP.
Exactly. So VPP in this chart that we have in the white paper is sort of it's a brief moment that you're at the full VPP. And then once you get to level 4, you're into grid adapted VPP or what, Sunrun would call with a DPP. And so at that point, you've gone beyond what a conventional power plant can do. And now you can both support the regional grid at the sort of transmission generation level, and you can support the distribution grid.
So how do we do that? How do we get from level 3 to level 4? Is there a clear threshold, or is it just added complexity, more data? What's the sort of transition from level 3 to level 4 look like?
It's kind of all of the above. So you do need better data. You need tighter control loops. But I think more importantly than all of those, you need better integrations into systems, right? So you either need the ability to see what congestion exists or other conditions would exist on the distribution grid, or you need the distribution grid to be able to articulate to the VPP that, hey, I need some help on this substation here or further down into this feeder or all the way down to the individual service transformer. And so no one can be at level 4 on their own. Level 4 is a group activity, a highly integrated system of systems.
Yeah, you need the grid that's ready for it as well as a VPP that's ready for it.
Exactly. And so level 4 is something that we're pretty far along in terms of the technology pieces, and we are doing limited demonstrations today. So today with batteries and EVs, we can, in real time, balance the loads on the grid to make sure we're, for example, charging a fleet of cars overnight, making sure that we're not overloading any piece of the grid for longer than it's able to do that, shifting power around to better sponge up the available wind power or based on the price of electricity. So there's a co-optimization, multiple kind of variable optimization going on. Mm-hmm. And do all of that at multiple different levels up a big kind of hierarchical chain, from the very local to the very system-wide. The limitation, the reason why we wouldn't say, okay, great, we're done, we're at level 4, is just that is not being done in a fully automated, fully integrated way at scale.
Is that true across the board? Is there anywhere where the grid is sophisticated enough to support one of these level 4 VPPs?
No. Nobody is has the whole system.
In the world?
No.
So getting to level 4 VPPs is about evolving VPPs, but it's also about evolving grids. So just the grids are communicating with the resources better. And then once you have level 4, you have this collection of resources that is optimizing for distribution grid performance. Then it's also optimizing for what the customers need, and it's also optimizing for what the bulk transmission grid needs. It's got all these different parameters, and it's supporting all these objectives at the same time, which you point out, and I think this is crucial. I'll actually read a quote here from the report. When a VPP can meet each of these requirements, full stack optimization, which means optimizing for all these different criteria, locational awareness, which means it knows where it is and where help is needed, wholesale and retail market integration, and ultra-fast telemetry, it becomes a preferable substitute for conventional generation. And this is the grail, right? Like a level 4 VPP is like a super power plant. It's better than a power plant.
Yeah, why would you not want a thing that is cheaper, greener, more customer-centric, and faster to deploy than all the alternatives?
And has more capabilities, like you can't store surplus electricity in a power plant, right? Like this literally can do things that power plants can't do.
The thing to remember in terms of why we're not at level 4 today is that the system for years has run on design margins. Distribution grids, you didn't need real-time control of the system because when you were building the grid, you applied margin that meant that you always had a little bit of a cushion. But what we've been doing is eroding those cushions for the last 30 years, right? We've been electrifying homes. My house has electric heat pumps for heating and cooling. I've got an EV charger. I've got an induction stove. A bunch of people like me get those, along my section of the grid, and suddenly there's a bunch of load that nobody assumed would be there. We've been installing random power plants. We've been installing, in the form of solar panels. We've been installing batteries that can discharge in a way that nobody planned for. And then at the same time, you have all this load growth on the grid. And so all of those design margins that we used to be able to count on, we can't necessarily count on anymore.
I should just insert, because one thing that's come up a bunch in recent pods is why are power prices going up in the U.S.? And the big piece of that puzzle is the distribution grid is rising in cost all the time. I think probably because of what you're talking about.
Right. The poles and wires, the fixed costs of running the grid are not getting cheaper.
Well, this brings us to sort of like the value delivered by VPPs. And this, I think, is really interesting. You'd think sort of like a kilowatt is a kilowatt. This is not really true. Like once you get more sophisticated VPPs, they're producing more and more kinds of value. So like level 0 and level 1, more or less the bulk of the value you're getting out of those is you're avoiding having to generate energy. Otherwise, basically, you're like removing some demand, so you're avoiding those generation charges. That's the bulk of the value, and that value remains large as you go up the levels. But as you go up the levels, you get more and more. And this is what I find interesting: is you're avoiding, and there's a little sliver even from level 0. You get a little sliver of avoided transmission capacity. This is something that, of course, VPP folks like yourself talk about all the time. Rooftop solar people are constantly talking about, like, the more local gen and storage you do, the less transmission infrastructure you need. So that's a piece. But once you get to level 2, you get this new piece, which is avoided distribution capacity. And that gets to be a pretty big piece by the time you're at level 4. And so I think it's intuitive, but just talk a little bit about how a sophisticated VPP would help avoid building distribution capacity. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy. And it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. I think it's intuitive, but just talk a little bit about how a sophisticated VPP would help avoid building distribution capacity.
In many ways, it's the same problem as you have at the transmission level, right? Somebody does an analysis and figures out what is the sort of maximum coincident demand for power going to be on this piece of wire that stretches through this neighborhood, or how big does this service transformer need to be to serve the 4 homes that are behind it? And so if you put something in 10 years ago and you still have plenty of extra capacity, then great. Until that thing wears out, it'll just keep doing its job. But if load grows behind that thing, at some point you get to the point where you've got to replace it. And so the question is, what if you don't? What if you can just say, we're going to avoid setting a new peak demand, or we're going to avoid having the demand on this component last longer than a certain amount of time? And so if you have a system that's looking across DERs and saying, okay, I've got this many cars behind this thing, I've got this many air conditioners behind this piece of equipment. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at a forecast for how they're all going to come together, and I'm going to figure out which pieces of this demand puzzle I can shift to the right or to the left. You can bring that peak moment down, and you can avoid an upgrade. And it's possible that you could avoid that upgrade for, at the very least, table stakes would be a few years. But ideally, you're talking about avoiding that upgrade essentially forever for the length of that component.
And it's basically, yeah, like you say, it's the same thing as on the transmission level. You're just trying to reduce peaks, basically. Like it's peaks that trigger the need for new infrastructure. And so it is possible to add more to the grid, more demand, without driving that peak up.
And in fact, it's actually really good if you can add load without driving that peak up, right? Because now you're spreading the cost,
yes.
a fixed cost over a much higher amount of usage. The one other thing that people don't talk about a lot here, but is becoming more and more important as a result of climate change, is that most of the limits we talk about in the physical grid are thermal limits, right? So there's some piece of equipment that you put enough power through it, it gets too hot, and there's some component in that that's going to wear out. A lot of the time you have a decent amount of cushion. That thing can get pretty hot for a few hours, so long as it has a chance, say, to cool down overnight. Well, what if it doesn't cool down overnight? So, for example, in Arizona, not only are they setting records for number of days where the high temperature is over 100 or over 110 degrees, they're now setting records for the number of days where the low temperature is higher. So I think they had like 100 days where they didn't go below 90 overnight.
Nightmare fuel.
Exactly.
Absolute nightmare. So gross.
So again, back to those sort of design margins, if you had a margin of safety based on the idea it's going to cool off and then this component's going to cool off, what if it doesn't? And so again, this allows you to just sort of spread that thermal load out and squeeze more out of the system.
I mean, this is just basically reducing peaks, which is like the whole thing you want to do, is if you keep your peak where it is or lower, and you can keep adding capacity. And also, by doing that, as you say, like you are better utilizing the infrastructure that you already built. We paid for all this infrastructure. And because these peaks are so high, most of the infrastructure is only getting used a tiny, tiny fraction of the time. So just utilizing existing poles and wires more fully, I think, is a huge thing. And this is something I'm going to return to in future pods, I think, is going to be thinking about sort of regulatory and legal ways to basically force utilities to better utilize the infrastructure they've already built. And the only way to do that is through VPPs, basically.
The thing that I think gets lost here is when you've got an entire industry that's used to valuing things a particular way that is based on a set of, engineering assumptions. It's hard to update those engineering assumptions if you don't have the data. So what we hear from a lot of utilities is that basically they're fully on board with doing as much of this as possible. But the difference between like a level 0, say through a level 2 VPP and one that's at level 4 is we've known what the business model was for the lower levels for years, right? Somebody at some point took the capital cost and the O&M of running a gas peaker and translated that, through some derating into, this many dollars per kilowatt annually for system-wide capacity that's available 60 to 80 hours a year. But when you're moving into levels 3 and 4 and you're saying this thing is highly available or it's highly distributed, there isn't like a number that everybody agrees on what it's worth. Or if you're talking about we're going to extend the life of this component, there's a question of by how long. And so it's pretty hard to take that kind of hand-wavy uncertainty and turn that into something where the utility can go to the regulator and say, we think this is worth paying X for. And the regulator can with confidence say, that's a prudent investment. And so this becomes a chicken and egg problem for the industry.
Yeah. Well, this is what all the pilot programs are supposed to do, right? This is why we're in pilot hell forever, is like we're supposed to be demonstrating. That's the point of all these pilots and test programs that utilities are constantly running, is to show that they work. Are none of those, like, how far along is that process?
I mean, I think we're well along in that process. And so what we see most utilities doing is they're running programs at scale way beyond the pilot stage, levels 0 through 2 or 3. And they're essentially taking small slivers of those programs and doing sort of locational pilots. And I think in the next year or two, we will start to see enough data emerge that it can then start feeding back into the regulatory process and into planning processes. But again, this is why we felt like there needed to be a common language in the industry to sort of talk about how we're doing and how far along we're going.
So you think we're close to a point where some utilities are going to have the confidence you're talking about?
I think we're very, very close, yeah.
And the one other thing I want to say about the value delivered by VPPs, so as you say, once you get to level 4, you're getting avoided generation, avoided transmission, avoided distribution, and some ancillary services, grid balancing services, once you get up to level 3 and 4. But one sort of value that's not on this chart is the value of resilience, which I think is very difficult to measure precisely. It's just not a convenient metric, but strengthening distribution grids is resilience. Like, that is basically what resilience is. So this, is this something that is a selling point for you, or the resilience benefits? Does that come up a lot when you talk to policymakers or anything?
It does. It does. This gets a bit into sort of a piece of this that I would say isn't really captured by the framework itself, which is these VPPs are built up of devices that are in people's homes and businesses. And the question is, like, how did they get there, right? And so if you look at a place like Arizona, lots of people have smart thermostats because everyone has air conditioning, and we've spent the last 10 years, people have just been buying smart thermostats. If you look at places like California, where power prices are really high, you have lots of solar and lots of batteries that are there to help people save money. And then if you look at a place like Puerto Rico, where their grid was destroyed by Hurricane Maria, you've got huge numbers of people who invested in solar and batteries just to keep the lights on. And so they started with sort of their own personal resilience of how do I make sure that I have power when the grid goes out. But once it's there, it becomes this latent resource that the grid can tap into. And so Puerto Rico is a great example where they are literally keeping the lights on because of these battery-backed VPPs. And so it's in the background, as it were. But what's fascinating is that there's a positive feedback loop to be built here, which is that as utilities or other grid operators recognize the value, they can turn that value into incentives for customers. And the incentive for customer then drives adoption. So in places where there is a really strong incentive to participate in a VPP, you see people buying more batteries, buying more smart thermostats, and renting them out to the grid.
I talked with Pierre Lafarge, a pod last year, about utilities running these things, running VPPs, doing it on purpose, and procuring them deliberately. So what I'm sort of wondering is, like, once utilities are really confident that these things work, right, that they've seen how they work, they've seen how to make them work, it seems like you could go beyond incentives. How do you get beyond the consumer model here? Because when I think about scale, I think, how are we going to get to scale when we're basically trying to persuade one consumer at a time to do these things? There's got to be some bigger way to do this, some bigger, bulkier way to do this. So I wonder, like, if a utility really believes that a VPP can reduce peaks in a particular part of the grid, in a particular congested part of the grid, could you envision a utility on purpose building a VPP in that part of the grid? You know what I mean? Like sort of putting out an RFP and like paying for and owning the solar panels or the batteries in the backyards or whatever and running it as a utility, actual utility asset. You know, in other words, being proactive rather than just accepting VPPs that come along.
Yeah.
Being proactive and building them where needed.
Well, so this is interesting because there's an element of that is sort of actually that's the old way of doing things, that the original residential demand response programs, because people didn't have smart thermostats or smart water heaters, the utility would give you a free, pager-based thermostat
right.
and install it for you. And the downside of that model is now the utility is on the hook for the cost of the hardware. They've got to roll a truck to your house. They've got to install it for you. They have to pay for all of that. And now anything that ever goes wrong with that is their fault, right?
Yeah.
And so those were successful, right? Like there were some utilities that installed, a couple million of these things. But if you contrast that with what happened with IoT devices, we now have tens of millions of homes with batteries, thermostats, and EVs installed. And so that's where kind of the BYOD model came from. And this is basically where EnergyHub's business succeeded, was 12, 13 years ago, we saw, hey, these categories of products are taking off, and we can adopt the business model that worked for first-gen DR and apply it to this new delivery model, which is bring your own thermostat, bring your own battery. And in that case, you're basically you're building a partnership between the customer, the DER manufacturer, typically like the local kind of installer base, the trades, and the utility or the grid operator. And I actually think that, all the data shows that is vastly more scalable than kind of like a centrally planned version.
Interesting. So right now, most VPPs are hovering around level 2. Some of them are nudging up into level 3. And as you say, there's not really any place ready for a level 4 yet. Let's talk about how to get from here to there. Sort of what, you lay out a little bit of a roadmap in the paper. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to do, that the VPP industry needs to do, and then some of the things that you would like to see utilities do to bring more level 2 VPPs into the bright future of level 3.
Yeah, so some of the things that are if I look at sort of, the chart and at level 4, like where does EnergyHub sort of most glaringly not make the cut? It would be in the realm of telemetry. We can't provide 2 to 6 second telemetry to provide, essentially a true real-time view of what's going on with every level of the resource.
And now why is that? Is that a lack of fiber? Is it a lack of communications technology? Is that a practical or technological limitation? Why is that?
Today, it's a technological limitation in the sense that we need to take a bunch of very noisy signals that are coming in at various time intervals and create sort of a synthetic telemetry signal back to the utility that accurately represents all that way in a way that sort of strips out the irrelevant noise but keeps the kind of core of it necessary for the utility operator. So that would be an example of something where in aggregate, that's clearly on EnergyHub to solve.
And you presumably have a room full of nerds somewhere.
Exactly.
Beavering away on that project.
Hundreds of nerds working on that. But that's not a real problem today. Whereas if I look at where are the real problems today in the industry, there are things like, okay, when I push the button and I tell one of our DER partners to dispatch, 200,000 devices, do they get it done in 1 minute or do they get it done in 15 minutes? If they're not getting it done in 1 minute, it's probably because they never really had a reason to in the past. Nobody told them that was important. And so there's just engineering work to refine data pipelines to make that better. And that's where I think most of our partners are. You then have a bunch of things that are just pieces of sort of pure accumulated brain damage over the years. Like vendor A will only allow us to put their devices into 100 groups. Someone made a decision in 2015 that said, how many groups would I ever need? 100. And so they never made the decision, one utility might have 5,000 individual groups where we need to map the distribution grid to devices. So a lot of this stuff is really like boring, random, practical decisions that got made a long time ago that have to get kind of undone and have to be aligned across the industry to make the thing work coherently at level 2 or at level 3.
Are those software?
Yes.
Software cruft, mostly you're talking about?
Software cruft. That's a great way to put it, yes.
And that's on the utilities then to update their...
No, that's generally actually on the DER ecosystem, where I'd say that what's on the utilities tends to be maybe in some of what you need for level 3 and 4. So it's pretty common, for example, that a utility would say all of the data feeds that, a DERMS platform like EnergyHub's would need, say, to read the conditions on the grid, those data feeds are completely locked down for very real security reasons. So someone needs to come up with a highly secure, practical, and scalable solution to expose that to a system like ours. And then you just need to go through rounds and rounds of testing to make sure that these systems talk together, they begin to make automated decisions together, and then you needing to just figure out, is the behavior what you'd expect, or are there weird emergent things that come out of that just have to be sort of discovered and dealt with one by one?
One of the things you hear, I did a whole pod on this a couple of years ago, is that VPP can't take off in certain places because utilities just won't share that data. You got all this smart meter data that's required to coordinate VPPs that basically utilities won't share. Is that a substantial barrier? Have you run into that? How big of a deal is that for you? And do you think it's changing at all?
I don't think it's a substantial barrier, but I think my lens is maybe very different than some of the other folks you've had on the pod or who might be listening. Like, I don't think most utilities want to or should expose a lot of this stuff to very many other systems out there, right? There are very good reasons why some of that stuff is really locked down. And this is essentially why utilities choose a relatively small number of systems to run sort of their operational stack. Mm-hmm. And so part of the role of a DERMS, so the acronym Distributed Energy Resource Management System, is about primarily managing the DERs, right? It's not a grid management system, but it needs to be sort of thought of as a utility system for them to get comfortable opening this up to one system. And so the way we view it is that our DERMS ends up getting very tightly coupled to a few pieces of utility system. And then everything that's downstream from us is completely uncoupled. And I think that is the correct sort of architectural design for these things. Sometimes people look at this and they hear the things that we've been talking about, like, access to these data feeds or security issues or the complexity of this. And they say, wouldn't it just be simple to do all this with like price signals?
I've got several listeners, Seth, who are on the edge of their seats this entire pod with that on the edge of their lips.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that they have settled on the one thing that would be even more complicated, right? Is how are you supposed to come up with some sort of complex price discovery mechanism that not only represents conditions in some sort of incredibly complex, scalable way, but also allows for something that's a plannable resource, right? Something where you're actually making future, forward-looking, forecastable decisions, and something that any consumer wants to or can wrap their head around. So I don't see any path that doesn't involve a small number of companies like EnergyHub and a few of the folks who are kind of in the control room figuring out some complex integrations. Every other solution is even more complicated.
Oh, I'm going to do a pod devoted to that subject soon because, there are people out there who are very, very enthusiastic about the ability of prices to do this. And I can sort of see how price signals could do the short-term coordination, just the sort of day-to-day diurnal stuff, some peak shaving, stuff like that. But as you say, these long-term goals, long-term plans, do price signals contain that information? Do they contain our long-term intentions and goals? Anyway, we'll dig further
The one thing I'll say is just, even if you're just thinking about kind of system-wide resources, if you look around the world at places where they have, more complex time varying rates, where you tend to have like a deregulated industry and people can sign up for a supply plan that has, 24-hour ahead, 15-minute intervals or hourly or 5-minute, whatever, you don't see hugely successful VPP programs running in those countries. The only place that I'm aware of where you have really, really successful large-scale VPPs is in the US, and it tends to be concentrated in places where you have regulated utilities. So if price signals were the solution, we would see it working.
It's so interesting to me. Yeah, actually, I heard you on the DER Task Force pod talking about this. And I'm sort of curious, like, and just to sort of frame this for the audience, like, you would think VPPs being a sort of distributed, kind of market sensitive sort of thing would be cropping up where there is market competition. But instead, as you say, where you are actually seeing them is where there are vertically integrated utilities, where there's central planners. Is there a capsule explanation for that? Is there a 30-second explanation for that? Why is that?
There is definitely a 30-second explanation. The great unsung benefit of having utility is that the utility abstracts all the complexity of planning and running the grid.
Mm-hmm.
You flip the light switch and the lights go on and you don't think about it. And utilities do an amazing job of just rolling up all these costs and coming up with a simple way to charge you based on the amount of power you use.
Right.
Now, obviously, we are at a point where we need to advance that a little bit, but we don't need to go all the way to dynamic local marginal prices.
Well, this will be a fun debate to track over time.
Somebody said to me, I didn't expect to become a full-blown regulated monopoly apologist, but I have been all over the world talking to utilities about this, and every time I come back saying, okay, I see what you guys are trying to do, but just look at what's working in the US and try to copy it a little bit.
So interesting to me. I've seen, I've been doing this for 20 some years now, and I've seen sort of elite energy opinion swing this way and that on the merits of.
I love that. Elite energy opinion. Yeah.
Vertically integrated utilities versus competition. And I've noticed a lot of people kind of coming back around after a long journey, kind of coming back around to the merits of good old fashioned monopoly utilities. And then, of course, there are other people who hate them more now than ever. It's an interesting dispute. So by way of kind of wrapping up, I wonder if there are any easy regulatory or legislative changes that you think would help accelerate the process whereby VPPs evolve from level 2 to level 3, level 4, and beyond. Are there easy, things you can tick off here?
Probably the first thing is for regulators to keep it simple with utilities. You give the utility a goal. It can be in megawatts. It could be in, an area of focus, a DER class. But generally, you want to kind of leave it open beyond that, where we see complexity creep into regulatory orders that just doesn't need to be there. Like, okay, you can only run this resource for this many hours. Or anytime you want to call on the resource, you need this many hours of notice or anything like that.
Is that PUCs injecting that sort of over-engineered kind of just overactive PUCs?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So don't do that. That would be number one. Number two would be to give utilities the green light or the encouragement to come up with hypotheses around some of these future value streams around deferring distribution and other things out into levels 3 and 4, and allow them to be doing these things at scale alongside what they're doing with the sort of system-wide VPPs. Where we have seen regulators really get it wrong is by, again, some of it is over-engineering, but saying like, okay, well, if you're running a smart thermostat demand response program, that has to be totally separate from like the distribution deferral study that you could be doing with the same smart thermostat demand response program. Or run an EV program, but only use the EVs for price response or something. So basically all of this stuff is just give the utilities goals, but don't over-engineer the requirements.
Right.
The final thing is just long-term stability. success at scale here requires sort of the entire industry to come together. And so where we see this really work, again, we always point to Connected Solutions in the Northeast as sort of the best example of the regulator getting it right, saying, okay, there's a 5-year guaranteed revenue stream for any battery provider or any aggregator that gets involved. And those folks can look at it and say, okay, well, if I put batteries in, there's $250 per kilowatt year available to me, and I know that's going to be there for 5 years. By the time that trickles down from Tesla or Sunrun to the local installers to the customers, it takes time. And you want to get to the point where you have momentum, where neighbors are telling each other, like, hey, did you get a battery? Like, they're basically half off if you sign up for the VPP. That's the stuff that really makes this thing work.
One of the things, just kind of like just between us and the listeners who have held on for this long, I like the idea that diversity is our strength here, that diversity of devices is a strength in the VPP market. I like the notion of it. But just between you and me, is it not batteries that are really doing the work here? Like, if you lost everything but batteries, but you had a lot more batteries, would you really lose any capacities, any capabilities, any abilities? Do you know what I mean? Like, isn't it really batteries that are kind of the workhorses here?
I see what you're saying. I mean, if everyone had a free battery of unlimited size, would this be easier? Yes. But like, a typical home or office building, the vast majority of the load is HVAC, right? So it would be a mistake, even if you have a battery, not to be able to control the load as well. And as a matter of fact, like, we think of an HVAC system or a water heater as a thermal battery, right? You can pre-charge it, you can discharge it.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I mean. Like storage of energy is timed storage and release is like the magic here.
Yeah, so I see that. But I think, like, if you go too far with that analogy, then you get into like, oh, well, is Bitcoin a battery? Or, I mean, isn't gasoline a battery? It's a store of chemical energy. So I love batteries. They are the most high-performing resource. They're fast. They're stable. You can command them to do exactly what they do. They have no impact on comfort. But a battery in a car is not the same as a battery on the side of your garage. And an HVAC system is still most of the load in most parts of the U.S. And so I think it makes sense at the very least to have all three of those.
Like, do you think we're going to get to a point where every device that consumes electricity is communicating bidirectionally and is involved in grid coordination in some tiny marginal way? Like, do you think that's just going to be kind of the default state of everything on the grid at some point? Like, is that where we're headed?
The short answer is yes, but I think that you do see some categories of appliances that somehow the companies that make those products are just not digitally native. And I'm not sure that they're ever going to be.
Like who?
Like, I own a fancy fridge and induction stove and oven. And like my Sub-Zero, whatever it is, my Wolf range, it can do one thing, which is send me a notification when the oven reaches its temperature. But the Wi-Fi, it forgets the Wi-Fi password all the time, or I get signed out of the app. So, like, I'm not sure that that's worth solving. Like, just go back to making the stove. I don't need an app.
Well, presumably, the ability to do that will get commodified and will standardized. You know what I mean?
Presumably, but here we are, like 15 years after IoT hit mass scale, and we're still not there. I mean, actually, a better example here would be if you look at the HVAC companies themselves. They are at least a decade behind the smart thermostat manufacturers in terms of delivering a really first-class digital user experience. That is not really a criticism of them so much as just a statement of they sell to their customers are HVAC technicians who then install them in people's homes. And it's a piece of equipment that's largely out of sight and out of mind.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate because the world actually really needs the heat pump manufacturers to get digitally native more quickly than they are.
Well, let me ask about that. Why? And the reason I ask is because replacing like resistance heat or natural gas heat with a heat pump, like a heat pump is very low consumption. it's low stakes in terms of VPPs. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I would think if there's one appliance that you're just not going to bother with, it would be heat pumps, just because there's so little kilowatts involved. Is that wrong?
If it's a heat pump for space heating, yeah, that is wrong, unfortunately. As I found out, I electrified my house during the pandemic, and I have heat pumps all over my house. And my electric bill is very high in the winter.
Are you in California?
No, I'm in New York. And so, the power in New York City is incredibly reliable, but it is very expensive. And it's expensive because the poles and wires are all buried. And,
Right.
and that means that it's very reliable, but very expensive. So there's a bunch of pieces if you unpack this. One is that I have no gas bill. So that's cool. I don't pay a gas bill anymore.
Yeah.
But now my Con Ed bill has gone up by a bunch. And I'm not necessarily thinking every time that my gas bill went down. And I think this is part of a broader sort of issue in the electrification trend, is that every customer who eliminates their gas bill has a corresponding increase in their electric bill. So that's one part of it. But the other piece is that the system architecture is different, right? If you have like a standard forced air HVAC system, you probably have one or two thermostats in your house. Whereas I have 10 in my house, right? There's basically a thermostat for every single heat pump unit. And as an interesting thing, I accidentally booted one of those thermostats offline. And I know a lot about smart thermostats and how to connect things to Wi-Fi. And I had to call my technician to come in and take the thing off the wall and like access some wireless module to reprogram it. So
Hilarious.
It's a different control system, and it wasn't envisioned in most cases to be simple and digital first.
Yeah. I sort of wonder whether, and I wonder if this is the model of change in your head too, is like all this sort of preparatory work is going on right now. I think a lot of it probably not visible to normal consumers, but like a lot of people, like you say, you got a room full of nerds working on telemetry. There's like people are working on the pieces of this. Do you think this is the kind of thing where it's going to be like slow, and then all of a sudden, and if so, are we close to the all of a sudden?
Yeah.
Or are we in the midst of the all of a sudden?
I think we're in the midst of all of a sudden. I think, people who have not been following EnergyHub's journey over the years will check in with me and they'll be shocked to find out the size we're already at. I still get questions from regulators about when is this thing going to go beyond pilots. And I'll tell them that we're running 500 megawatts of VPP in their state. So I do think that it's sort of one of those 10-year overnight successes. But at the same time, the goal we've set for ourselves is 100 gigawatts by 2035. And we are today approaching 4 gigawatts. So while it's very large in the context, 3.5 gigawatts is like, 2 nuclear power plants, right? That's great. I'm happy with that result. But to have an impact at a societal level, we need to be at that 100 gigawatt scale, which is like approaching the size of all of PJM. It's larger than Texas or England.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I've been wondering is if VPPs get that big and we get to a place where being involved, participating in a VPP is something close to kind of the default for big appliances and big systems and houses and everything else. Like, I just wonder if eventually this is just going to be part of what it is to be a utility, and it's not going to kind of sound like a separate thing. You know what I mean? It's not going to require a separate, you know what I mean? Somehow it seems like this is just going to become what utilities do.
I completely agree with you. I think you nailed it. I think that it becomes just what you do with the technology in your home or in your business, and it becomes just part of how the utility runs itself. I think that when you talk to customers, you have a lot of different segments out there. So there are definitely folks who are saying, I'm participating in this program because it meant that, I got a smart thermostat for free, or I got half off my battery. You also hear a lot of people saying, why not? Like, this has no downside, and it's one of the few tangible things I can do as a consumer to have an impact.
Yeah.
And from a utilities perspective, the average utility, especially today, has overwhelming pressure on their system, right? There are so many cost pressures that they are on the back foot in trying to figure out how do we keep the system affordable while keeping it safe reliable, and serving all of these sort of new loads that are coming online. And so if you can say, look, partnerships with your customers in the form of VPPs are going to just lessen that pressure, almost every utility is enthusiastic.
It's the cheapest. That. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've said this on this freaking pod, but like everybody wants capacity. Everybody wants grid capacity. And the grid capacity is the fastest to get because it already exists. It's already there. You just need to go aggregate it. Like, how long is it going to take utilities and like all these big, rich, wealthy entities that desperately want more grid capacity? Like, how long is it going to take them to arrive at this, what seems to me a pretty obvious conclusion?
Well, I think that those wealthy entities that want service, right, that want to get a service hookup for their data center are actually ready and willing to build, for example, on-site storage to help firm that power supply. And this goes back to things that regulators can do. And there's plenty going on with this right now. Making it easy for a data center or any other large load to come online and co-locate storage that just from day one has the ability to either help firm the supply capacity or export to the grid. There's no reason not to do that everywhere in the U.S. right now.
Well, I would go beyond that. And this was my other final question, by the way. I remembered it. And so this is really going to be, I think, my fifth, but definitely final question, which is, and I've raised this possibility with a bunch of different guests now, and there's a lot of different talk about it. So I think you got all these hyperscalers who desperately want to build their data centers. They desperately need grid capacity. I think you could go beyond asking them to build on-site storage. Why not ask them to fund VPPs?
We are doing that.
Why not ask them to build? They have all the money. Like this came out of when I interviewed the guy from Piclo, the guy who's trying to set up a marketplace for this. He's, he did the calculations. Like 3% of the money that's flying around in the data center world could get you like 100 gigawatts of VPPs. It would be like $40 billion of new revenue for the VPP market. And it would be good for the utilities. It would be good for the data centers. It would be good for the VPP operators. It's all upside. What the hell? Is that going to happen? Are you talking to data center people?
We are, and that will happen. I think that both makes sense from a rational economic perspective, and it's an obvious win.
Yes.
If you think about the level of sort of community anxiety about these data centers,
yes,
an opportunity for someone to say, hey, we're funding batteries everywhere around.
Yeah, for a utility to say, look, a data center came, they wanted to hook up, we brought them to heel. We forced them to fund heat pumps for you. Like, here's what you're getting from this data center showing up. You're getting a heat pump. What a win for the utility.
Yeah, and there's models for this, right? Like for years, it's been common to someone wants to build a manufacturing plant or a data center, and they say, we're going to put money into the community to upgrade roads or whatever it is. So this it fits with that pattern, and so I think it's going to take a couple of years for that to start happening at scale. But from the conversation we're having right now, that looks pretty promising.
Yeah, that to me is so interesting. It's a win for everybody. It's a win for the data centers too. They get their capacity quickly. They look like Santa Claus passing out gifts rather than the Grinch coming to steal all your power. And then customers get VPPs. They get better grids. Like, it's a win all around.
Yep.
Okay, Seth, this was awesome. This is exactly what I wanted. Like I said, I've been talking about VPPs for a while, but it's really helpful to sort of dig in and remember that there are kinds, there are stages. And I think the most sort of exciting kind of thing to come out of this conversation is just that we are on the cusp of VPPs really becoming what they could be, becoming true, important, predictable, reliable participants in day-to-day grid stability.
Well, I'm glad you're excited about it. We are obviously also excited about it. This kind of nerdy stuff is all we do.
Man, you've been at this since 2007. Like, respect, Seth. You had like genuinely, like, I started doing what I'm doing, in the early 2000s and just kept doing it. And my wife is the same. So like, just a shout out to people who like figure out what they want to do and just do it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And I want to say for anyone who is also excited about this and has strong feelings about this framework that we put in the paper, the purpose was to start a conversation. And so I have already heard from some folks who are important in the industry saying, hey, I have a different take on what the requirements are for this or that. We want to hear from you. So by all means, please reach out to whoever you know at EnergyHub, or just kind of, knock on the digital front door.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.